Hello everybody, Mannix here. I'm going to do a gun review on the Glock 19 Gen 5. I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, I'm a big fan of Glocks, and if you like the 9mm and you like Glocks as it already is, this is a choice one to own. So what you'll get are the 3 magazines out of the package, speed loader, and the gun itself obviously, and then the little cleaning brush as you saw in there. I believe these retail for $569. You can get these for around the $540 range as far as mid-late 2023 is concerned. The stock magazines are 15 rounds. Now I can tell you confidently, after handling this one as well as the 17, although the 17 you get a little bit longer of a barrel, a little bit higher of a capacity, and a slightly longer handle. It's just a little bit more extended. This gun is right in the sweet spot of being just compact enough that I personally, my hands, I have just enough to grip onto. The barrel's just long enough to keep it nice and accurate, keep a nice high muzzle velocity for what it is, as far as the 9mm is concerned anyway. It carries very well. It's going to be a little bit lighter than the 17. Now, comparing the Gen 5 to the Gen 4, it's not a night and day difference or anything, but we have serrations up here on the front of the slide rather than just back here, which the 19 Gen 4 only has. The finish is a little bit different. It has a kind of a darker, glossier look on the slide right here instead of a more flat, dark gray look the Gen 4 has. We also do not have finger grooves up here that the Gen 4s do. This is going to be a little bit more versatile, arguably less comfortable, but some will argue it's more comfortable without the finger grooves. Personally, I could go either way. This is certainly going to be a little bit more versatile of a design anyway. The corners are a little bit more rounded. They're slightly more squared off on the Gen 4s. We have ambidextrous slide releases on the Gen 5s. On the Gen 4s, we're limited to only the one on the left side, meant for your right hand. And the trigger pull is a little bit lighter, roughly 8% lighter, if I'm not mistaken, in comparison to the Gen 4. So the trigger will pull just a little bit easier. Just like all Glocks, there is no manual safety on the gun whatsoever. It is embedded within the trigger. It's that little switch, if you're not familiar. This has to be depressed in order for the trigger to be pulled. So if I try to pull this trigger right here without touching this button at all, it won't pull. If that button is also depressed, then the trigger will pull and the gun will fire. Before I go any further, let me get some specifications out of the way. The overall length of this gun is 7.28 inches. The slide length itself is 6.85 inches. The gun's width is 1.34 inches, and the slide width itself is 1 inch on the nose. The height, including the magazine, is 5.04 inches, and we have a 2.76 inch trigger distance. Without a magazine, this guy weighs 21.52 ounces. With an empty magazine, 23.63 ounces, and with a loaded magazine, 30.16 ounces. And we have a trigger pull of 26N. The barrel length on the inside is 4.02 inches. It is a polymer handgun, which keeps things nice and light. Obviously, the slide is metal, but most of the rest of the gun is polymer. Personally, I really like the way Glocks look. I think they're cool. No, they're not beautiful. They're not sexy. They're not gorgeous by any means. There's some really, really sweet looking guns out there, but as far as looks are concerned, I still think it's good looking. I don't think it's ugly. It certainly is a tool. It looks like a functional tool, and it functions beautifully. I like these ergonomics on here. Again, we don't have an extreme design. I like the depressions we have in the handle right here. They fit your thumb very well. It's relatively an ambidextrous firearm. And again, personally, I don't miss the finger grooves on my hands anyway. I don't know what it was. My fingers tended to land in the wrong spots for whatever reason on the finger grooves, or I felt they were a little bit too wide. I don't know what it is, but I could go with those two. I don't mind them. It's just, I don't mind it really either way. I like how versatile of a handle this is. I like the sort of checker pattern we have on here. And it feels pretty slide heavy because the handle is polymer, but it does keep things nice and light. Sights, I'm kind of lukewarm on Glock sights. I don't dislike them, but I'm a sucker for fiber optics, but regardless, they work just fine. No major issues with those whatsoever. Reliability is through the roof on Glocks. For the price point, you really cannot beat a Glock very easily. They just fire and fire and fire. They extract the shells beautifully. No reliability issues pretty much whatsoever as far as Glocks are concerned. And then we have a little accessory rail on the front for a flashlight, laser sight, whatever you want to put on there. I like the trigger pull on these things. Not too light. It doesn't have a hair trigger, but it doesn't have a creepy trigger either where you're just pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling. Oh, when is it going to fire? And it finally does. No issues with the trigger whatsoever. So if anything, I'm going to say I like the Gen 5's slightly lighter trigger pull in comparison to the Gen 4. And again, I'm used to the 17. I've carried that for the longest time, and then I stepped down to this guy. Personally, I like this gun more for the 9mm. I'm not saying it's a better gun overall. It's just for carry, everyday carrying. It's just a little bit lighter, just carries a little bit nicer. It's accuracy is good enough. Its muscle velocity we have in the slightly shorter barrel right here is good enough. Now, if you really want that extra range, that extra muscle velocity, you want those extra couple of rounds, you want an even less recoil, you want even more controllability, then sure, step up to the 17. It'll be a better performing firearm overall. Obviously, it's more powerful. Obviously, it's just easier to manage because it's bigger and heavier. There's more to hold on to physically. But if you just want something for everyday carry, and you're not going to make this your primary firearm, it's not going to be your primary home defense firearm, it's not your only firearm, this, I think, personally is a slightly better option just because it's slightly more compact, and I think 15 rounds is still plenty. The recoil's still not too bad, even out of this gun, even out of this slightly lighter, slightly smaller profile we have here. It still works just fine. Glocks in general are chunky. You know, I feel like my fingers anyway want just a little bit more to wrap around because it's a big, chunky ass handgun. Again, it's not really an issue. It's just a nitpick of mine. The slide is just beautiful on that. One last thing I forgot to mention about these Gen 5s is that they have orange internals on the magazines rather than it matching with the same color as the outside of it. I see that as a huge advantage. Not a big deal, but I just think it's cool. I like seeing the orange there. It just makes it easier to spot that it's out of ammo. You know how that goes. I do like how you can count the ammo easily on the back. No problems with the slide releases. I do like the front serrations. Again, not a big deal, but if you prefer to rack your slide up here, makes it a little bit easier for that. It's aesthetic. I think it looks good. Let's load this guy up with some 9mm snap caps. Let's talk about the 9mm real quick. In fact, let me show you how the speed loader works if you're not familiar. Just gonna drop that sucker right on there. Helps us shove down the cartridges just a little bit easier. It's particularly more helpful when we're almost at capacity in the magazine. It gets more and more difficult to compress more cartridges in there naturally. That's when these speed loaders come in. Maybe you have slightly weaker hands, maybe you find that difficult, or maybe you just got to break the magazine in still. That's when these little speed loaders come in handy. Nice little touch they throw in with all of the Glocks as far as I'm concerned. Snap caps are fun. I've always said that. But yes, the 9mm. I love the 9mm. It's not my favorite round, but it's up there. There's a reason it's so commonly used. There's a reason it's talked about so often. There's a reason so many handguns use it. The FBI, law enforcement in the US, it's used a lot for a lot of good reasons. It's right in the sweet spot of being just powerful enough to typically stop the threat, but it's extremely affordable. One of the most affordable cartridges on the market. The recoil is very, very manageable, especially out of a gun this size. It's extremely low. There may be oddball cases where the 9mm possibly may not be good enough. If someone's possibly inside of a car and for whatever reason you had to shoot inside of there and get into their thoracic cavity. Again, there's some more dire situations where the 9mm may not be effective enough, but generally speaking, general purposes, they're more than adequate. They do just fine. All kinds of attackers, even heavily padded, 9mm is good enough, I say. You could step up to the 40 Smith & Wesson. There's other Glocks for that. They're going to have a lot more recoil. They're going to be considerably more expensive, but if you just want that extra bit of power, that extra bit of velocity, that extra bit of weight, you could step up to that, and then you can step up to the 45 ACP. But the 9mm, again, it's right in that sweet spot of covering all of the options and checking all of the check boxes. Low recoil, affordable, good enough. Because of its smaller diameter as well, you can fit more rounds in the magazines for these size guns. So we also win with higher capacities. Now let's talk about the safety real quick. Because there's no manual safety on here, it's only embedded in the trigger. It's kind of debated. A lot of people say some different things, but the general consensus is the Glock can only be carried in either condition 0 or condition 3. And if you want to get to condition 4, that's another story. We're not even going to talk about that. But condition 0, meaning you threw a round in here, you racked it, you loaded it. If you pull that trigger, it's going to go bang. There's no safety mechanism. There's no additional steps. You just pull the trigger. That's it. It's going to fire. Your other option is condition 3, which would be the magazine is loaded, but you don't chamber it. So if you were to fire this thing in a situation where you had to, you'd have to rack that slide first, then fire. Personally, I'm not against condition 3. If you're going into an area where you're not looking for any trouble, you have absolutely no chance of negligent discharge. But a lot of people laugh at condition 3. A lot of people crap on it, for lack of a better term. Here on the internet especially, condition 3 gets a lot of flack. A lot of people say it'll get you killed. You'll hear things like, you shouldn't be carrying a firearm at all if you're only carrying condition 3. Personally, I disagree. I don't see what's wrong with condition 3. It is an additional step. You do have to rack the slide first. And if you're in a dire situation, maybe both of your arms aren't available. available to you, yeah, you're not going to be able to fire the gun if you cannot rack it. That's true. But every defense case is different. Again, it's certainly the safest option. Some people argue with condition 3, you have less of a chance of somebody else grabbing onto the firearm you're carrying and firing it. If this was racked and the cartridge was in the chamber, somebody could technically do that. There's no safety mechanism on here. They pull the trigger, it's going to go bang. I'm not saying either configuration for carry is wrong. I'm just saying there's advantages and disadvantages. Personally, I don't have an issue with condition 3, but again, you are limited. You got 0 and you got 3. Either you pull the trigger and it's going to fire, or you got to rack it and then you have to fire it. Those are basically your options with these Glocks. Now, the advantage to just having the safety mechanism in the trigger and no additional safety mechanisms anywhere is that you don't have to worry about muscle memory. If you rotate through different guns, what if you have the safety on and you forgot you put it on? If you extract this and you try to fire and it's not firing because that safety's on, you got to fiddle around and look for it. Maybe you forgot where it was in particular. Again, if you use different guns, you should be very trained and familiar with your firearms regardless. But situations like that do happen. That's why we talk about these things. That's one of the reasons safety mechanisms like this were proposed and invented. The main advantage to this thing I see personally is that there's no fiddling around, no muscle memory, very, very simple. Some people don't, which is one of the many reasons a lot of people don't like Glocks. I'm not saying it's objectively a good thing or objectively a bad thing. I'm just stating the facts. That's how it is. This is the mechanism you're going to get. You're not going to get any additional manual safety mechanisms on a Glock of any kind that I know of. The Glock 19 is another great option from Glock. Personally, it's my favorite 9mm Glock. There's a lot of different ones out there, but it's the perfect size, I think. Personally, if I'm gonna sacrifice more space and more weight and have an even larger, bigger, heavier gun, I'd rather have a larger caliber cartridge, 40 S&W, 45 ACP, even 10mm, so on and so forth. So I think this is the perfect size. It's a very good weight. It's one of the lighter guns you'll get at this size for 15 rounds of 9mm. And that's a very large capacity too, especially for this size handgun. The 17 for me kind of juts out a little bit extra. That's not a bad thing. There's technically more to control. And again, we'll have lower recoil with that guy and an even higher capacity, higher muzzle velocity, more accuracy, stronger. I still think this is more than adequate. If you just want something that's a little bit more carryable, just a little bit more compact, this is the ticket right here. Now, if you wanted to step down to the 19 Gen 4, you'll save maybe about 40 or 50 bucks currently as I'm filming this right now. You'll get the finger grooves. You won't get these front serrations right here. The trigger pull will be a little bit different. You won't get a slide release on this side. Minor differences here and there. It's not the end of the world. If you just want to save the money, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Gen 4s. They're still fantastic handguns. But if you like this guy more, hey, I think it's worth it. The extra 40 or 50 bucks, you'll be all set. So anyway, that's it. That's one of my favorite 9mm out there, the Glock 19 Generation 5. Feel free to subscribe, hit that little bell notification if you do not want to miss weekly gun and knife videos. Thank you so much for watching. Mannix out.